The Ontario housing market is experiencing something we haven't seen in over a decade, and the numbers coming out of Premier Doug Ford's own government are absolutely staggering. Housing starts across the province have plummeted by 23% this year alone, while Toronto has been officially labeled as the epicenter of weakness for residential construction across all of Canada. But here's what nobody's really talking about. The Ford government's own target of building 1.5 million homes by 2031 is now so far off track that they won't even confirm if it's still achievable. We're looking at a housing construction crisis that's affecting over 15 million Ontarians, and the ripple effects are about to hit every corner of the economy. If you're a first-time buyer watching home prices in some areas drop while supply continues to shrink, if you're a current homeowner wondering what this means for your property values, or if you're an investor trying to figure out where the opportunities are hiding in this chaos, this video is going to give you the insider perspective you need to navigate what's coming next. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel because we're bringing you the real data behind Ontario's housing crisis that mainstream media isn't connecting the dots on. Right, let's get into it. Look, when you dig into the actual numbers from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the scale of this collapse becomes crystal clear. From January to July 2025, Ontario managed just 38 and 21 new housing starts. That's not just a modest decline, that's a 25% drop compared to the same period last year. To put that in perspective, while Ontario's housing construction is cratering, Quebec saw a 38% increase. British Columbia only dropped 4%, Atlantic Canada jumped 16%, and the Prairie provinces increased by 24%. Ontario isn't just lagging, it's moving in the complete opposite direction from the rest of the country. Here's where the math gets really brutal. Ford's government set a target of 125,000 housing starts for 2024. They achieved 94,053. That's a shortfall of over 30,000 units in a single year. Now, if you take that 94,753 number and break it down, only 73,462 were traditional housing starts. The rest were padded with student housing, long-term care beds, and retirement homes. They're literally changing the definition of housing starts to make their numbers look less catastrophic. What's wild is how this compares regionally within Ontario itself. Toronto, which should be the engine of housing construction, saw housing starts drop by a staggering 44% in the first half of this year. We're talking about the city that recorded only 12,575 housing starts, down from over 22,000 in the same period the previous year. When Toronto fails, it doesn't just affect the 6 million people in the Greater Toronto Area, it creates a domino effect that impacts housing markets from Ottawa to Windsor. The condo market tells an even more devastating story. Pre-sales for new condominiums in Toronto have hit their lowest levels since 2009. Remember 2009? That was the global financial crisis. We're now at the same level of market paralysis that we saw during one of the worst economic collapses in modern history. Here's where it gets really serious. The average Toronto condo that was selling for $1.2 million at peak is now seeing price drops of 3.2% for detached homes and 3% for attached homes. But here's the kicker. Construction of new supply has essentially frozen. Now let's talk about what this means in real dollars and cents. A typical Ontario family looking to buy their first home is caught in what economists call a supply-demand trap. Even though prices are starting to soften in some segments, dropping by 5.5% year-over-year in the Greater Toronto Area with the benchmark price now at $963,000, the lack of new construction means this price relief is temporary. When you have 15 million people in Ontario competing for a shrinking supply of new homes, basic economics tells you prices will eventually surge back up, and hard. But here's the calculation that should terrify every current homeowner. Ontario needs approximately 150,000 new housing starts per year just to keep up with population growth and household formation. At the current pace of 33,121 in 7 months, we're on track for maybe 58,000 housing starts for the entire year. That means we're creating a cumulative housing shortage of nearly 100,000 units annually. Multiply that over the next 5 years, and Ontario will be short 500,000 homes by 2030. The really brutal part about all this is what's happened to the construction industry itself. Major developers are canceling projects left and right because the economics simply don't work anymore. Construction costs have increased by 35% since 2020, while developer fees imposed by municipalities have skyrocketed. In Toronto alone, development charges can add $150,000 to $200,000 to the cost of a single unit before you even break ground. When you combine that with interest rates that hit 5% and higher, and pre-sale markets that have essentially dried up, developers are walking away from projects that were profitable just 2 years ago. Here's what makes this fascinating from a policy perspective. Doug Ford came into office promising to cut red tape and boost housing construction. His government passed Bill 23, the More Homes Built Faster Act, which was supposed to streamline approvals and reduce fees. They eliminated rent control on new builds. They overrode municipal zoning in some cases. Yet despite all these pro-development policies, housing construction has gone into freefall. This suggests the problem runs much deeper than just government regulation. The hidden crisis that most people don't see is what's happening to Ontario's construction workforce. Over the past 18 months, an estimated 45,000 construction workers have either left the province or switched industries. These aren't just laborers. We're talking about skilled tradespeople, project managers, and specialized contractors who took years to train. When a mason or electrician leaves construction to drive for Amazon or work in a warehouse, that's not a temporary adjustment. That's a permanent loss of specialized human capital. But here's where the numbers get really staggering. The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation estimates that 60% of all outstanding mortgages in Canada are expected to renew between now and 2026. That's over 1.2 million households who are going to face significantly higher monthly payments when their current low-rate mortgages expire. In Ontario, where household debt-to-income ratios are already the highest in the country, this renewal cliff could force hundreds of thousands of families to sell their homes. Now let's talk about the policies and external factors that are making this crisis worse, not better. Premier Ford's government has been caught in what policy experts call a policy whipsaw. On one hand, they're trying to encourage development with tax breaks and streamlined approvals. On the other hand, they're imposing increasingly strict environmental assessments and Indigenous consultation requirements that can add 18 to 24 months to project. Timelines. Developers tell me they're spending more money on lawyers and consultants than they are on actual construction. The federal government's impact cannot be ignored either. The Liberal government's foreign buyer tax, their speculation tax, and their stress test requirements for mortgages have all contributed to cooling demand. But cooling demand doesn't help when supply is falling even faster. Add to that the uncertainty around Donald Trump's proposed tariffs on Canadian goods, and developers are dealing with supply chain costs that could spike by 15 to 25% with virtually no warning. Here's where the municipal-level politics get really messy. Ford's government has been trying to force municipalities to approve more housing through legislative threats and funding incentives. But mayors from Toronto to Ottawa are pushed back hard, arguing they don't have the infrastructure capacity to support massive housing increases. Take Toronto Mayor Olivia Chow's position. She supports more housing in principle, but argues the city needs billions in federal and provincial infrastructure funding before they can handle significant population growth. The school board crisis adds another layer of complexity. The Toronto District School Board is already over capacity in most neighborhoods. Adding thousands of new housing units without corresponding school construction creates a political nightmare for municipal politicians. Parents start showing up at city council meetings demanding to know where their kids are supposed to go to school. This isn't theoretical. This is happening right now in communities across the Greater Toronto Area. Now let's talk about the opportunities that are emerging from this chaos, because while most people see crisis, smart money sees massive opportunity. First, the rental market is becoming incredibly lucrative for investors who can weather the current storm. Purpose-built rental construction is actually one of the few bright spots in Ontario's housing data, up 12% year-over-year. Why? Because rental demand is exploding as fewer people can afford to buy, and the math for rental developers still works even with higher interest rates. Here's what makes this particularly interesting for investors. The average rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Toronto is now $2,400 per month. A new rental building with 200 units generates $5.8 million in annual revenue. Even with construction costs at current levels, the return on investment for purpose-built rental is running 8 to 12% annually. Compare that to buying and renting out individual condos, where your return might be 3 to 5%, and you can see why institutional investors are pivoting hard toward purpose-built rental. The second major opportunity is in what economists call secondary markets. Cities like Hamilton, Kitchener-Waterloo, and even Sudbury are seeing increased interest from developers who've been priced out of Toronto. A developer who might need $800 per square foot to make a Toronto project work can build profitably in Hamilton at $450 per square foot. The provincial government's geo-transit expansion means these secondary markets are becoming increasingly connected to Toronto's job market. But here's what makes this fascinating. The small-scale developers and custom builders are actually thriving while the big players struggle. A custom builder who specializes in high-end single-family homes isn't dependent on pre-sales or condo market confidence. They work with clients who have financing already arranged and aren't as sensitive to broader market conditions. I'm seeing custom builders in markets like Oakville and Burlington with 18-month waiting lists. The renovation and addition market represents another huge opportunity. When people can't afford to move up to a larger home, they renovate their existing home instead. Home improvement spending in Ontario increased by 23% in 2024, and that trend is accelerating. A skilled contractor who specializes in additions, basement renovations, or laneway housing is essentially recession-proof in this environment. Now let's get into what the experts are predicting for the next 2 to 3 years, because the timeline for recovery is longer than most people realize. The Royal Bank of Canada's latest housing forecast predicts that Ontario home prices will continue declining through late 2025 and into 2026, with the steepest drops in the Greater Toronto Area and Ottawa. They're projecting price declines of 5 to 8% from current levels before any meaningful recovery begins. The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation is even more pessimistic about construction activity. Their model suggests Ontario housing starts won't return to 2023 levels until at least 2027, assuming interest rates drop significantly and development financing becomes more accessible. That means we're looking at 3 to 4 more years of housing shortage accumulation before supply starts catching up to demand. But here's where the predictions get really interesting. Several major Canadian banks are forecasting that the combination of falling home prices and continued supply shortages will create what they call a spring-loaded recovery sometime in 2026 or 2027. The theory is that pent-up demand from years of deferred purchases will combine with improved affordability from price declines to create a sudden surge in both buying activity and construction starts. BMO's chief economist is predicting that Ontario home prices could increase by 15 to 20% in a single year once this recovery begins. That might sound impossible given current conditions, but remember, we've seen this pattern before. After the early 1990s recession, Toronto home prices jumped 25% in 1996 alone once market confidence returned. The key variable that nobody can predict with certainty is interest rates. If the Bank of Canada cuts rates more aggressively than currently expected, bringing the overnight rate down to 2.5 or 3% by late 2025, the housing market could recover much faster than these conservative forecasts suggest. Conversely, if global inflation proves more stubborn and rates stay elevated longer, we could be looking at a much more prolonged adjustment period. Here's what this means for different groups of people, because the action plan depends entirely on your specific situation. If you're a first-time buyer, the math is actually starting to work in your favor for the first time in years. But timing is everything. The combination of softening prices and potential rate cuts in 2025 could create a narrow window of opportunity. But you need to be prepared to act fast when that window opens, because improved affordability will bring a lot of competition back into the market very quickly. Your strategy should be to get pre-approved for a mortgage now, even if you're not ready to buy immediately. This gives you a rate hold for 90 to 120 days and helps you understand exactly what you can afford. Start monitoring specific neighborhoods and property types so you can recognize a good deal when you see one. Most importantly, don't try to time the absolute bottom of the market. If you find a property that meets your needs at a price you can afford, that's more important than waiting for theoretical additional price declines. For current homeowners who are considering selling, the decision is much more complex. If you're planning to downsize or move to a less expensive market, the current price softness could actually benefit you. Remember, if you're selling a $1.2 million home in Toronto and buying a $700,000 home in Hamilton, a 5% price decline saves you $25,000 on your purchase, but only costs you $60,000 on your sale. The net impact is negative, but less than you might think. However, if you're planning to buy another property in the same market after selling, you're probably better off waiting. Selling and buying in the same declining market rarely makes financial sense unless you're driven by other factors like job relocation or family changes. For investors, this environment requires a much more sophisticated approach than the buy anything and it will go up strategy that worked for the past decade. Focus on cash flow over appreciation. Look for properties where rental income covers your carrying costs even at current interest rates. This means either buying at significant discounts to peak prices or focusing on markets where rent-to-price ratios are more favorable. The key is understanding your numbers, knowing your local market dynamics, and being ready to act when the right opportunity comes along. The next 18 to 24 months are going to separate the serious players from the speculators in Ontario's housing market. The opportunities are there, but they require patience, preparation, and the ability to move quickly when conditions align in your favor. This isn't just a Toronto problem or even just an Ontario problem anymore. What happens in Ontario's housing market affects migration patterns across Canada, federal housing policy, and ultimately the financial stability of millions of Canadian families. The decisions Doug Ford's government makes over the next year about development fees, approval processes, and infrastructure investment will determine whether Ontario emerges from this crisis stronger or faces years of continued housing shortage and affordability problems. The math is simple, even if the politics are complicated. Ontario needs to get back to building 120,000 to 150,000 housing units per year. At current trends, we're not even close. That gap between what we need and what we're building is the single biggest economic challenge facing this province, and it's going to take a lot more than political promises to fix it.